On May 6, 1998, a column of Eritrean armor ground across laterite tracks into the Badme region. T-55 tanks and BTR-60 armored personnel carriers kicked ochre dust into the morning air as they advanced toward positions held by Tigrayan militia and Ethiopian police. Small arms crackled across the scrubland. Rocket-propelled grenades streaked through the haze. The firefight lasted hours, not days. But those hours detonated a war that would kill more people than Kosovo and East Timor combined. Badme possessed nothing worth dying for. No census had recorded its population, though estimates placed it at perhaps 1,000 souls living in mud brick tukuls and simple masonry structures scattered along unpaved roads. The settlement had no airport, no rail connection, no paved highway, no industry. Most international cartographers had never bothered to include it on their maps. The surrounding terrain was semi-arid scrubland near the Sudanese border, home to farmers and agro-pastoralists, whose identities as Eritrean or Ethiopian had been fluid before politics made them fixed. Yet this cartographic afterthought had become a test of national will. The Eritrean People's Liberation Front had contested Badme since 1984, insisting that colonial-era treaties placed the village on Eritrean soil. Ethiopia countered that decades of Ethiopian administration superseded old maps drawn by Italian colonizers. Neither government could yield. For Eritrea, barely 5 years independent after 30 years of liberation struggle, territorial concession meant existential betrayal. For Ethiopia, accepting Eritrea's interpretation validated secession and invited further fragmentation. Within days, both issued formal declarations of war. Troops mobilized along a 1,000-kilometer front. What began as a border skirmish over a village with no apparent value metastasized into total war between former liberation allies. The war was not merely a border dispute, it was fratricide. In the early 1980s, when the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front numbered fewer than a few thousand guerrillas, the Eritrean People's Liberation Front had trained and armed them in the harsh Sahel mountains of northern Eritrea. Young TPLF fighters learned to strip Kalashnikov rifles and fire RPG-7 launchers under EPLF instruction. They sheltered in EPLF-liberated zones when Ethiopian government forces pressed too close. They ate what the Eritreans ate. They bled alongside them in trenches and mountain camps. The relationship was never equal. Isaias Afwerki, the austere leader of the EPLF, viewed the Eritreans as the elder brothers of the Horn of Africa's liberation movements. The Tigrayans quietly resented this, but could not openly challenge it while they depended on Eritrean sanctuary. Together, the two movements coordinated the final offensive that toppled the Derg military government in May 1991. EPLF forces captured Asmara on May 24th. 4 days later, EPRDF columns entered Addis Ababa. So complete was the trust between them that Eritrean fighters provided personal security for Meles Zenawi during his first years as Ethiopia's prime minister. But the trust curdled slowly, then all at once. By August 1997, disputes over currency, port access, and border demarcation had poisoned relations. Isaias sent a formal letter to Meles protesting Ethiopian encroachment at Badme, demanding immediate withdrawal. The letter went unanswered. Both men had spent decades in guerrilla struggle where compromise meant death and retreat invited annihilation. When the shooting started 9 months later, two former comrades, who had once coordinated by radio to topple a dictatorship, faced each other across a border neither could afford to lose. The armies that mobilized anticipated a swift, modern conflict. What they constructed instead belonged to 1916. By late 1998, both sides had excavated extensive trench systems along the entire front. On the western front around Badme, Eritrean engineers constructed deep echelon defenses with interlocking arcs of fire. Communication trenches zigzagged back toward supply dumps. Bunkers burrowed into hillsides, barbed wire belts stretched across every approach. Minefields seeded the killing grounds with anti-personnel ordnance. Ethiopian forces built parallel fortifications on their side of the contested zone, sometimes separated from Eritrean positions by only 50 meters of cratered ground. United Nations observers arriving in 1999 struggled to process what they documented. Their reports explicitly compared the fortifications to the Somme and Verdun. The resemblance was not metaphorical. These were genuine First World War trench systems, miles of interconnected earthworks, frontal fire positions reinforced with timber and stone, barbed wire obstacles stretching across no man's land. Private Tesfaye Haile occupied a firing position on the heights above Badme in late January 1999. The trench was chest-deep, scraped into rocky highland soil the color of dried blood. Sandbags reinforced the parapet. Corrugated metal sheets provided overhead cover against shrapnel. The air tasted of cordite residue and the chemical bite of disturbed earth. Red dust coated everything: his rifle, his uniform, the inside of his mouth. Water came in jerry cans rationed to 1 liter per day, emerging warm and tasting of rust and plastic. He had not bathed in 19 days. The trench walls were too narrow to lie down properly. Men slept sitting upright or curled into fetal positions in shallow scrapes dug into the trench floor. At night, temperatures dropped sharply, and soldiers wrapped themselves in whatever fabric they could find. By morning, the cold gave way to punishing heat that cracked lips within hours. Ethiopian artillery opened fire at unpredictable intervals. The shells arrived without warning, the concussion pressing against eardrums like a physical weight. Between bombardments, the smell of the latrine pit mixed with the metallic tang of old blood from a position where a direct hit had killed 4 men the previous week. No one had been able to recover all the remains. Behind the trenches, both nations mobilized on a scale that defied rational calculation. Eritrea, with a population of barely 3.5 million, fielded approximately 350,000 soldiers by mid-2000. 10% of every man, woman, and child in the country, a mobilization ratio exceeding even the First World War's most desperate levies. The World Bank would later calculate that Eritrea devoted 30% of gross domestic product to defense spending during the war years. Government expenditure reached 119% of GDP, a fiscal impossibility, sustained only through emergency borrowing. Both nations spent between $1 and $2 million per day prosecuting the war. Much of this treasure purchased machinery from the surplus arsenals of the former Soviet Union. Ethiopia acquired Su-27 fighters from Russia at roughly $30 million per aircraft. Eritrea countered with MiG-29s at $20 million each. Hundreds of refurbished T-55 and T-62 tanks rumbled toward Badme alongside BM-21 multiple rocket launchers and 152mm howitzers. Nations where most citizens lived without electricity were importing the means to conduct artillery barrages that would have impressed Verdun's gunners. On February the 23rd, 1999, Ethiopia launched Operation Sunset to recapture Badme. For 2 weeks, the town and its environs shook under continuous bombardment. Ethiopian guns pounded Eritrean trench systems, while tanks, helicopter gunships, and jets struck defensive positions. The offensive followed a brutal pattern. Hours-long artillery preparation preceded massed infantry assaults across open ground, seeded with mines. Eritrean defenders, dug into elevated strongpoints, repulsed the first waves with concentrated machine gun and artillery fire. Ethiopian commanders accepted the inevitability of heavy attrition, judging it a price worth paying for a decisive breach. Private Dawit Tadessa went over the top on the morning of February 25th. The order came at 05:45. Officers blew whistles. NCOs shouted. Men climbed from the trenches and began walking toward the Eritrean lines 300 meters ahead. The sun had not yet risen. The eastern sky showed the first gray of dawn. The first mine detonated 40 meters into the advance. The man who triggered it ceased to exist from the waist down. The sound reached Dawit a fraction of a second later, a sharp, percussive crack, followed by screaming. He kept walking. The officers had been clear. The assault would not halt for casualties. Eritrean machine guns opened at 200 meters. The sound was distinctive, the rhythmic hammering of PKM belt-fed weapons, the higher cyclic rate of Kalashnikovs on automatic. Men fell. Some dropped instantly, folding at the knees. Others spun, clutching wounds. The air smelled of propellant and copper. At the wire, men threw themselves onto the coils, using their bodies to press the barbed strands flat so others could cross. Some screamed as barbs punched through uniform fabric and into flesh. Dawit tumbled into the Eritrean trench and pulled the trigger at a range of less than 2 meters. Blood sprayed back onto his face, warm, viscous, tasting of iron. For nearly 2 weeks, Eritrean troops held. They launched counterattacks that briefly regained ground. Then, in a span of hours, a thinly held sector was broken. Ethiopian forces poured through the breach. Facing encirclement, Eritrean units withdrew from Badme to avoid annihilation. By late February, Ethiopia had recaptured the town. An estimated 30,000 men died on both sides within those weeks, casualties that would have shocked even Haig or Joffre. Ethiopian General Samora Yunus would later boast that the Eritreans are good at digging trenches, and we are good at converting trenches into graves. While soldiers perished by the thousand, the world looked elsewhere. Between 1998 and 2000, the Eritrean-Ethiopian War killed an estimated 70,000 to 100,000 people. This figure exceeds the combined death tolls of Kosovo and East Timor by an order of magnitude. Yet both dominated Western headlines, while the largest conventional interstate war since Iran-Iraq remained confined to brief wire updates. During the height of fighting in May 1999, the New York Times ran Kosovo on the front page almost daily. Eritrea and Ethiopia appeared perhaps once that month, buried in the world news section. Both leaders understood this dynamic and exploited it. They knew they could sustain industrial-scale slaughter without meaningful external pressure to stop. The indifference was structural, rooted in what diplomats called Africa fatigue after Somalia and Rwanda. On May 12, 2000, Ethiopia launched its largest offensive of the war. Within days, Ethiopian forces broke through the western trenches near Badme. The Central Front collapsed next. By early June, Ethiopian forces had captured Zalambesa, Tserona, and Berhane, occupying roughly 25% of Eritrean territory. Hundreds of thousands of Eritrean civilians fled ahead of the advance, on foot toward Keren and Asmara, carrying small bundles, abandoning fields and homes. Almaz Tesfa Mariam was 23 years old and 7 months pregnant when the offensive reached her village outside Berhane. She walked for 3 days. The road surface was packed dirt churned into fine dust by thousands of shuffling feet. It coated her hair, her nostrils, the inside of her mouth. It tasted of minerals and smoke from the burning villages behind them. On the first night, she slept beneath a thorn acacia, the ground stony and cold. Her back ached from the weight of the pregnancy. On the second day, Ethiopian aircraft passed overhead. The tearing roar sent people diving into ditches. She stood frozen, hands pressed against her belly, as if she could shield the child inside. On the third day, she reached a camp outside Keren and sat down. She did not know what she was waiting for. By mid-June, facing military collapse, Eritrea accepted a ceasefire. On June 18, 2000, Both governments signed the Cessation of Hostilities Agreement in Algiers. Ethiopia had won tactically. Both nations were ruined. On April 13, 2002, the Eritrea-Ethiopia Boundary Commission delivered its unanimous verdict in The Hague. Their finding was unambiguous. Badme village fell on the Eritrean side of the line. The decision was legally binding. Both governments had agreed to accept it as final with no possibility of appeal. For a moment, it seemed the nightmare might end through law rather than more bloodshed. Then Ethiopia refused to implement it. The Ethiopian government denounced the Commission's decisions as illegal, unjust, and irresponsible. Ethiopian troops remained in Badme. What followed was 16 years of frozen conflict. Both nations maintained massive standing armies they could not afford, diverting resources from everything development required. Minefields remained uncleared, families remained separated. International law had spoken with perfect clarity. 100,000 people had died over a legal question that now had a definitive answer. Yet Badme stayed under Ethiopian control, its legal status ignored. The war demonstrated that in the modern era, you could still fight like 1916, and if you did it in the right place, the world would simply look away. Private Berhane died on the night of June 16, 2000, 2 days before the ceasefire he did not know was coming. His patrol had been sent to observe Ethiopian movements near Tserona. He stepped on the mine at approximately 0300 hours. The device was an OZM-72 designed to launch into the air before detonating at waist height. He heard the click of the pressure plate releasing, felt the soil shift beneath his boot, and then the darkness filled with light. The patrol leader found him 17 minutes later. Both legs had been removed above the knee. He was conscious. He was asking for water. There was no water. There was no medical evacuation. There was nothing to be done except hold his hand while his question stopped. He died at 0342 in a crater on a ridgeline, in a war that would end 48 hours later over a town he had never seen. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more World War historical deep dives every week. Thanks for watching.